Well, here we are again, back to the Ten Commandments. Despite what they used to say at the end of the A-team, a plan doesn't always come together. Back at the beginning of January, my plan was to deal with these 10 words of God for 4 consecutive Sundays. Unfortunately, snow required the cancellation of a couple of services, and so I lost my way and my plan had to be altered. I'd hoped during those Sundays that we would come to recognize that the 10 Commandments don't easily fall into that convenient formula by which we were once taught to perceive them. That formula we learned went something like this. The first 5 commandments are about our relationship with God. And the second 5 commandments deal with our relationships with others. Or the first 5 are about loving God. The second 5 are about loving neighbor. However, as I prepared for these sermons, I became more and more convinced that these commandments resist any such reductionism. These 10 words are not uttered in isolation of one another. They are interrelated and they are interconnected. They fold back on one another, if you will. Perhaps we looked at the commandments this way. One command set guiding our relationship and our love with God, the other our relationship and love of neighbor, and they were simply folded one to the other. But my experience is these commandments are more like this paper. You open them up, and then they fold in on top of each other. They are not in isolation. They're not easily divided between God and neighbor. However, when studying these commandments, it does matter where we do begin. And several weeks ago, I said we had to begin with the acknowledgement that God is. The 10 Commandments begin, as you heard Gina read a few moments ago, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. God liberated these people from Egypt. God set them free. And these 10 words, these 10 commandments, define the relationship between the God who liberates and His people who have been redeemed. The 10 Commandments are to be honored and obeyed by God's people, not out of a sense of duty or obligation, but out of our gratitude for what God has done for us. We are grateful that God Almighty has set us free from the powers of death. As Christians, we do not approach the 10 Commandments as if they were natural, universal, moral laws that should be accepted or acknowledged by everyone. No, we see these 10 Commandments as coming from God to us, defining God's relationship with us and defining how we shall live with one another as God's witnesses in the world. You see, when we are shaped by these commandments, we have a particular identity by which we are identified by others as God's people. And I would argue with you that our Christian identity has suffered, primarily because we have lost all the moral distinctives that tell us who we are. And if we do not know who we are as Christians, I feel confident that the world cannot identify us either as God's people. You see, these 10 commandments remind us that there is a God, and that the God whom we worship acknowledges no rivals, no substitutes. We are not to make images of God for ourselves. We are not to use God's words to get our way. We worship God alone, for the God whom we worship is a jealous God. There is a day of rest for God's people because God rested. And if the Creator of all the universe rested on the Sabbath day, surely the ones He made, His creatures, need to rest. And this day of rest is for everyone, not a select few. It does not exclude anyone. It is a day of rest for child and slave and alien and animal. God's people are to honor father and mother. This commandment is not a club we pick up to force our children to obey us. This commandment speaks more directly to our responsibility to take care of our aging parents. This commandment is not about being good or bad children or parents. It's about honoring those from which we came to life. We honor a commandment that tells us that we shall not take a life from another, because this person was created in the image of God, and only God can give life. The commandments tell us to honor our marriages by honoring the one who shares our bed. The commandments speak of God and neighbor. The neighbor before us, the neighbor beside us, the neighbor in our house. The remaining commandments that we take up today appear to set boundaries for our life living together. Our life together in a neighborhood, a village, a church. How do we live together with integrity? How can others trust us in a relationship? Once again, these commandments, these words are pithy and straightforward. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness. You shall not covet. I believe that you and I understand these commandments on a visceral level. If you are here this morning and you ever had anything stolen from you, taken from you, no matter how small or how large, I suspect that you can remember that feeling, not of just the loss of your property, but a sense of somehow that you had been violated, assaulted, and victimized by another. If you have ever lived through an episode in your life where people distorted what you had to say, or told lies about you, or cast judgment against your character, you know that words maim and kill. You also know that when your character has been attacked with words, that when your friends and your loved ones are silent, that silence is the most deadly killer. If you were ever desirous of what someone else appears to possess, the perfect marriage, the perfect children, the most beautiful home, the fulfilling career, the well-connected friends, the respect of others. If you have all spent your life comparing your life to someone else's, you know firsthand the misery of coveting, of greed, of jealousy. And those three create a hell of our own making. Now, our three commandments for today appear to be fairly narrow in their focus. You shall not steal. Narrowly, this means do not steal a person's life or belongings. And in the beginning, it may have been associated with kidnapping or stealing another Israelite slave. You shall not bear false witness. Narrowly, this commandment means not to give false testimony before judges or others who must uphold justice and guard the common good and the public welfare. You shall not covet. Narrowly means not to desire something someone else has to the point that you begin to plan how you will take it from them. These are very narrow interpretations of what these three commandments mean. You shall not covet. The last of these 10 words easily helps us to see, I believe, the connection and the interrelatedness among all of these commandments. Do not desire something that someone else has to the degree that you plan to take it from them. You shall not covet. For coveting has a way of leading us to desire another's possessions, and when we take them, we have stolen from them. If we are envious of another's good name, then we may slander them, and thus we bear false witness. If we're desirous of another's marriage companion, we may obsess, we may seduce, we may commit adultery. If we take our desire far enough, we may even go beyond taking our neighbor's possessions, reputation, and marriage partner. We may take away their very life, a life fashioned in the image of God that only God can bestow. Yes, these commandments are interconnected. They fold in on one another, but they are not narrow. To see how expansive they may be, let's take, for example, you shall not steal. It may be involved simply taking another's belonging or possessions. But there are many, many ways of stealing. An employer fails to pay fair wages. An employee fails to deliver a day's work for a day's pay. A teacher fails to give his best in instructing and preparing for his students. A student fails to give her best in the classroom. People use their influence and their connections to secure a favorable position for themselves, while those without influence, without status, suffer as a byproduct of our securing our advantage over another. We take advantage of cheap labor so we can have cheap goods. And people we don't know on the other side of the globe live in poverty and work in terrible conditions, long hours. It may even be that we consume too many of the world's resources, and by doing so, we are stealing from our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. We take someone's words or ideas as our own, and we have stolen them. Thou shalt not steal is not as narrow as taking someone's belongings. You shall not bear false witness. We may simplify this commandment to say simply, you shall not lie. Once again, we may see how troublesome this commandment becomes. We manipulate data to prove the point we are trying to make. One of our news organizations actually calls a time in their news show going to the spin room, where we try to shape events and perceptions of events in ways in which we want to advance certain agendas. We may advertise making our product appealing without regard for its quality or its performance, its enhancement or danger to those who buy it. We gossip about someone and we steal their good standing in community from them. We manipulate accounting procedures. We claim deductions that we are not entitled to. We form a dummy corporation offshore so that we don't have to pay taxes that are due. There are many ways to steal. There are many ways. If you ponder these commandments very long, you begin to see how they are intermingled. Murder, adultery, lying, stealing. Stealing, lying, adultery, murder. There are countless combinations, but they're all deadly. Undermining trust among people and shredding the fabric of community. It is hard to have community where there is no trust. It is hard to trust where we steal from one another and lie to one another and we covet what we have or what another has. It appears to me that the last commandment we read, you shall not covet, begins to lead us beyond our actions to our motivations, beyond our deeds to our desires. Taking his cue from this commandment, Jesus radically reinterprets and expands the meaning of these 10 commandments. He does this by forcing us to face the power of our desires and our motivations and our emotions. You see, Jesus says a simple casual remark like, you fool, can begin to lead us down the path toward disrespect and to anger and finally murder. Jesus says this desire, this envy, this lust leads us to adultery. Jesus says if we go beyond simply saying yes or no, we find ourselves headed down the path toward exaggeration and fabrication and lying. If we covet, if we desire many things, we lose the capacity to discern what is best. Earthly treasures trumped heavenly treasures. Instant gratification and self-indulgence become the name of the game we play each day. Suddenly, a trip to Disney World is more valuable than the security of our homes where our children can feel safe and secure and loved without fear of going without. We cannot discern what is best when our hearts are set on many things. It seems to me that the most serious challenge of God's 10 Commandments, the most serious challenge these commandments present to us today is this. They refuse to acknowledge our radical individualism. The commandments tend to broadcast as loudly as possible that you and I live in relationship with God and with one another. Our insistence on being masters of our own lives and our own worlds leads us blindly down a broad way that leads to destruction, Jesus would say. This broad way undermines our faith, our marriages, our families, our communities, and ultimately the world in which we live. The greatest tragedy that we can see among religious people today, I would argue, is our widespread refusal to recognize and to honor God. Our primary commitment to doing only what we want to do, when we want to do it, only when it's to our advantage and our convenience, with no concern whatsoever to others, our families, or our communities. Our greatest religious failure today is the way we express our denial of God and the reality of God. It seems to me that one of the challenges we face is to accept that God and God's kingdom are as real as anything that we see or hold in our hands. Our Lenten devotional group on Wednesdays is reading through Henry Nouwen's Here and Now, and one of the readings this week took me down hard and rubbed my nose in some things I wish I could have avoided. Henry posed these questions. Why is it so difficult for us to be still in the presence of God? Is it because I don't trust God? Is it because I don't know God? Is it because I wonder if God is really there for me? Is it because I am afraid of God? Is it because everything is more real for me than God? Now, I'm either quite unfortunate or quite blessed. I don't always know which it is. But from the very early days of my life, someone took me to church. And for the 61 years I have lived on this earth, I have been immersed in the songs, in the words, in the language of the church. And so, if you ask me, do you trust God? I would say yes. Do you ask me if I know God? I would begin to tell you all that I know about God. If you ask me if I ever wondered if God was really there for me on my side, I would say I never questioned that. If you ask me if I was afraid of God, no. I got over that long time ago. But if you said, Jamie, in the living of your life day by day, are there things more real to you and God? I would have to say yes. And that is what undermines my faith. That is what inspires my fear. That is what challenges me day by day. Because I am easily convinced that things out there are more real than God. And I think that those of you who are with me are legion. So we will begin today, we will conclude today where we began. So long ago we've forgotten we began. These 10 commandments are for God's people. People who are wise enough to know that God has liberated them from the powers of death. People that choose to receive and obey these commandments not out of duty or obligation, but out of gratitude, a joyful gratitude. These 10 commandments get us to the greatest commandments. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, and you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus very plainly says, I have not come to abolish the law. The law will stand. And Jesus also says to you and to me that our righteousness, our faithfulness to this law must exceed the Pharisees and the scribes who had committed themselves to the study of that law. Why is the law so important to Jesus? I would say to you it is because the law teaches us the way toward faith. And here's how it happens. To be faithful to God means we trust God with our very lives. And if we trust God with our very lives, then we obey and follow God's way. Faith is not in our heads. Faith is expressed every day when we live as if God is real. Faith in God is expressed, God is honored each day when we trust and obey. These 10 commandments lead us to the narrow way of life that Jesus came to proclaim.